There's one thing that I think would make this movie undermined is that the style teaching Fletcher does is one that is going extinct.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot, the podcast by storytellers for storytellers so that we can tell better stories ourselves. As always, I'm your host, Maverick, and today we have back with us one of our favorite guests, Sean Nolan, to review a legendary one-off movie, Whiplash. That's right. This movie was released in 2014. It's an American psychological drama written and directed by Damien Chazelle. As always, we want to get into the movie, know what it's about. Why is it something that's worth discussing today? We'll tell you in a second, but first, Sean, what are your initial thoughts on the film Whiplash?
Whiplash is a movie that is all about music and ambition. It features Andrew Neiman, who is a character played by Miles Teller, and there is a deuteragonist slash antagonist who's played by J.K. Simmons. And it is a movie about Miles Teller trying to become one of the best jazz drummers on the planet, and J.K. Simmons trying to push him towards those goals by any means necessary.
Nice. Yeah. Now, when you first watch, let's just get to the reviews, get that idea out there, and then we'll figure out why. But what was your rating off the 9-point system that we use to review movies on this podcast? What did you give this film, Sean?
This is a 9 for me. In order,
Nice.
like, for anybody who's listened to an episode that I've been on in past podcasts, this is a movie that I hold up as like the top end of the scale. Some people might say that the perfect movie doesn't exist, so no movie's a 9. I don't believe that rating systems should have an impossible to meet number, so this is what I consider the top end of the bar.
Nice.
Maybe someday in the future I'll encounter something that dethrones it, but for now, this is for the past like 2 or 3 years. This has been my default like greatest movie I've ever seen.
Wow, that is incredible. That is high praise. So, with that rating alone, you should at least give this a consideration. We do not take Sean's word lightly, and he makes good arguments, even in episode 8 when we didn't always agree with him. No, but he has good points. So, I personally think this is a very good movie as well. I did not give it a 9, but I gave it a 7.75. And even with that, I thought this could be higher. So, maybe Sean will convince me to raise it more. This is well within the rewatchable movie space. There is some things in this movie that I really liked, and if you've seen this movie at all, I will say this is an ending that made me go, that was perfect. I love that. That was so good. So, if that at all, wets your whistle and gets you ready to go, pause this, watch the movie if you haven't, come back, listen to our thoughts, because we want you to enjoy it as much as we did. But with that out of the way, we're going to get into the review like we always do, starting off with that opening scene. Sean, you know how they started off. They got the drumming, he's practicing, he's going full at it, and then he meets this guy walking in, and he says, "Do you know who I am?" And he said, "Why did you stop?" He proceeds to play, right? That whole opening scene introducing us to the main character and this antagonist slash teacher role that you have. What were your thoughts? Lay it all out there.
One thing that I think gets bandied about a lot in film criticism is subversion and the idea of subversion, or at the very least, like hitting the audience with something they do not expect, in the hopes that, like, by being unorthodox, it'll draw an audience in more. And a lot of the way the story's constructed is meant to like subvert expectations of like traditional like overcoming odds stories or stories about like personal ambition and success. And I think like starting it off, like this movie does not waste time trying to like introduce you to him joining the school, which you might like traditionally expect. Like, oh, he joins the school, some character that's already been there a year gives you like an intro. This is Schaefer Conservative Music Story, and like that guy is an expert, and this is the clique you're in, and this is, they don't bother with that. No, they just get straight into What does he want? He wants to be the best drummer in the world, and we get like an immediate introduction to J.K. Simmons. You know, these are the two most important characters in the movie, and it's not going to be about anybody else but these two.
Yep. Yep. And it's pretty tight with that. Even though you have, like, quote unquote, a lot of people in this film, in all actuality, the people who actually do any serious talking is a handful of people, maybe a dozen, maybe less, right? And even those who have serious screen time, probably like 5 or 6. So, this is very much a tight cast when it comes to who's actually in this film. And yeah, absolutely. You have it from the start. This guy loves to drum. And then you have the guy who's there who's challenging him on that. And he's the big baddie, I guess, if you will, from the start. And it's kind of interesting because, he's a teacher and he's also like, I mean, it's Fletcher, right? And he's demanding, but he shows some caring, especially at the beginning. And he has these big aspirations. So it's, yeah, very good for an opener. Very not, what's the word I'm looking for? Not standard compared to what you see normally around here, or at least normally in modern film, I feel like. And maybe that's because they spend a lot of time trying to introduce you or reintroduce you to the characters and what they care about and all that kind of stuff. Versus this is a lot more of a, I guess, like the Dark Knight type opener where it goes right into the action and you see, okay, this is the guy. This is what he's here for. This is what he cares about. Like, this is the same type of thing, but in a completely different world because we're talking about drumming, and we're talking about music, and we're talking about all that stuff, which I'm going to put a caveat on this podcast. I'm not really a music guy per se. I barely know a little bit of playing the piano, and that's pretty much the length and breadth of my experience. So if you know music, you might even appreciate this movie more. You might not. I don't know, because I don't actually know how music really works. I know from a storytelling perspective, I appreciated it.
This movie does do a good job at communicating like some important aspects of music and band music that is
Okay.
like approachable to an audience, right? Um, we'll discuss that more when we get to the climax.
Okay. Nice. Sounds good. We have this main character, right? We have Andrew Neiman, and he's basically started off with this idea that he's going to driven to succeed no matter what, right? He's willing to sacrifice so much to achieve this goal, and that's where he's off at the school. And he's not this jock like other people out there, and has these other aspirational goals. He knows what he wants to do, and he's setting out to do it. What were your thoughts on Andrew Neiman as a character and how they progress him in this film?
Um, I think one thing that I like is that Andrew Neiman is not necessarily a good person, but he's relatable. Like he doesn't he's not like a Greek tragedy where he is such an excessively ostentatious character that you're like
Right.
he's doom spiraling and nobody would ever do this. Simultaneously, it's not like he's a goody two shoes that's like slowly being corrupted by his ambition. From the start, we get this idea that he's willing to sacrifice love in order to achieve his goals. He's willing
Right.
to put down his family. He is someone who's like socially ostracized a lot of his life. We get like hints that he may have some sort of like autism or social disorder, where like
Mm-hmm.
he has trouble making eye contact with people when he like talks to them, and
Right.
so like he has like a lot of like things that are like influencing why he puts so much stock in drums, especially the conflict between him and his family, where he has the one dinner scene that like kind of really challenges why do we value certain kinds of success over other kinds of success? And when he doesn't get that familial approval, that drives him to want to do music even harder. Because if his family doesn't appreciate what he does, then he knows only the other people at the music school will get and truly appreciate what he does. What are your thoughts on Neiman as a character?
Well, no, I mean, I think I would echo and even extend some of the things that you say, that not only is he not really likable, as much as I like this movie, I kind of hate Neiman. I think Neiman is despicable as a character. But I respect, there's a certain sense in which and this is a whole discussion of the film, right? This is in some ways the themes of this film is like, how far should you be willing to go to achieve greatness? And like, what is the sacrifice? And is there a sacrifice that's too great? And this film explores that very well, like very, very well. And there's a sense in which it's so interesting too, and we'll get to Fletcher in a minute, but Neiman as a character, he is willing to sacrifice so much, and that discussion with his family is more or less a discussion where they go, oh, well, you know, we're doing these great things, and he's like, well, yeah, and they're like, you're going to be broke and, you know, on the streets, and he's like, yeah, well, I'd rather be broke and dead on the streets and remembered, right, rather than be this person who has all the accolades, who has everything that everyone wants, and then ends up, you know, being a nobody down the line. And so it shows like a difference in values in that too, but it's also like a whole treatise, if you will, to the drive that you have to have if you're going to be great. It's like, this is the kind of mindset you have to have, and in some
Well,
ways that means like,
this is the kind of mindset that people tell themselves they have to have. Because this movie is not just a question
right,
of whether the sacrifice is worth it. This movie also keeps asking the question, is sacrifice necessary in order to get to these heights? And like
right.
both Neiman and Fletcher seem to agree that the answer is yes. But simultaneously, you get a lot of hints throughout the film that they could walk themselves down this path because of the stories that they tell themselves and the mythos that they build up about musicians. And that, like, because they've heard stories that this is the way it works, they are going to continue operating this way.
True. True. Um, we'll get to more on that later. So I'm gonna put a pin in that. But yes, you're not wrong. Okay, yeah. So that's those are my thoughts on Neiman for now. I don't think we can continue this conversation adequately without also flipping over to Fletcher, because their conversations are intertwined. So unless you have more to say on Neiman,
Let's keep going.
we're gonna switch over. Cool. So what are your thoughts on Fletcher? Obviously, they introduced him. He's this hard, fast-paced man who demands a lot from his students. What are your thoughts?
I think this is the reason a lot of people come to see this movie, because either they've seen memes or they've seen trailers or they just see J.K. Simmons on the front and they go, J.K. Simmons is
Right.
yelling out and cursing out a kid. I'm gonna go watch that movie. Like you're watching
Yep.
Whiplash in part because you have an extremely compelling antagonist that's in Fletcher and like what he represents in terms of like are there people like this in the real world and what he represents in terms of like ideologically are just like core to the movie. I totally agree with you that like a lot of people probably don't like Andrew Neiman or watching Andrew Neiman. Like you can get
Right.
an ick from him, you're like, or you're getting like secondhand cringe, or you're like,
Right.
oh, I'm not sure about that. But with
Yeah.
Fletcher, you know who he is, but you
hmm
don't need to relate to Fletcher unless like you are a teacher. In which case, you can like go, oh yeah, let's go, keep doing this, while not
Right.
agreeing or sympathizing with him, just
Right.
because of the position he plays in the movie.
Right. Right. Well, it's like you're getting hardcore Gordon Ramsay vibes from this guy, where he's just going at these people, cussing them out, saying, you know, what is wrong with you? Why are you even here? Type stuff. And I was watching it with one of my friends, and he was commenting like, this is hilarious to watch, but it would be so awful to be the kid in the room and getting berated like this, because it is just a brutal experience, and that's how they play it out. Like, it is very visceral to watch. So he does an amazing job as an actor, I must say. Like, the Fletcher play through for him is just so good, and it's so, yeah, like, it's so interesting too, because even though you know he's being so brutal from the start, you know that he's doing this because he's pushing them to be better. And you might not agree with his methods, but you have some sort of at least respect, even from an audience, or at least I did from an audience perspective, saying, "Hey, you know, he's believes in this method of teaching kids, and he's doing his absolute best to create the best students. And that's one of the things he ends up saying later in the film is like, I am going to amount to nothing, and these kids will not amount to their true greatness unless I push them to be the very best. So,
And
you know,
it doesn't matter if they're mediocre, right? Fletcher believes that either you are like a one in a million history making musician
mhm,
or anything else is kind of a waste of people's time. Like art is this independently good virtue that like stands against everything else because it's the only thing that's remembered after you die.
right, right. Yeah, and that could get into a whole nother discussion just on that, like the valuing of art and the valuing of, is there objectively good art, is there not objectively good art, and like all sorts of discussions. So
Which is like, given this is about jazz music,
right,
like, is actually even more relevant than just like generically art. Like,
right,
this conversation about whether there's objectively good art, and like the way Fletcher teaches music is particularly like a conversation relevant to jazz music in the past 30 years. Because,
hmm,
like, out of all the musical art forms, jazz music arose from like a form of music that wasn't strictly regimented and had lots of like free form solos,
hmm,
where like there
right,
would just be a section within a song where it's like, okay, this band member is going to solo out, and there's not like some pre-written sheet music for it. But
right,
over time, as jazz music becomes celebrated or like recognized by the rest of America as not just black people music, but actually interesting, good music that's good for everybody to listen to, it starts getting taught in music schools. But once you teach something at school, you try and write it all in music sheet. You try and regiment it out. You try and
right,
say there's an objectively good way to do this music, and it's accomplishing all these combinations of notes.
right.
And so, like, even like just the genre of music is like playing into the conversations of the themes of the story.
I didn't even think about that. That is a very interesting point, though. And in some ways, you can take that and regiment it down to this podcast and making a rule set of how objective should telling stories be. We're lifting that off because we're sticking with our system. Reject it. No, just kidding. Anyways, yeah. Enough of the. We're getting too heady. Oh my goodness.
We're getting
This,
meta, okay?
yeah, we'll bring it way down now. All right, let's bring it back. Oh gosh, I don't even know where I was going on with this. We were talking about Fletcher,
Correct.
and we were talking about music, and yeah, that was amazing. What are your thoughts? I know you mentioned a little bit on the themes. I'd love to hear more about what your thoughts are on the meaning of this movie, especially from the beginning, and how we see those start to play out.
I think there are three groups of people that are going to grab a theme. One of them is applicable to everybody, which is ambition and like
Hmm.
following your ambition and whether it's worth it and what you're willing to sacrifice to accomplish those goals. The second group of people is specifically artists, and where like their motivation for their ambition is to create good art, and whether like that good art is worth whatever it costs you personally. And then the third group is neither of those people. Well, I guess it would be ambition, but it is teachers. And like, what
Hmm.
is a good method for raising the next generation and pushing people towards greatness? What's a good mentor? What's a good role model? Or should you even be a role model, but you should push them beyond who you are and be anything unlike you?
Right.
So, like, those are like the three core ideas that I think are handled a lot in this movie, and they're all compelling.
Yeah. No, I definitely see that. I didn't think of the art music and art one when I first saw this, but definitely the teaching one stuck out, and the other one about just ambition in general, right? Very much sticks out. And I think that's why this movie can have access to anyone. Like, even if you don't know music well, it still has a gripping idea of, well, what does it mean to be successful, and how far do you push yourself? What does that look like? As we briefly discussed. So definitely. What do you think? Well, okay, maybe I'll hold myself back a little bit again, because I don't want to get quite to the end yet. what are your thoughts on the movie in Fletcher's way of pushing the students, right? We mentioned that briefly, but he has this idea where he thinks that by going all neurotic on them and just being harder on them, this adds a lot of mental stress to Neiman, to the point where he even says to his girlfriend, "Hey, we shouldn't be dating anymore because you're going to pull me away from my musical career, and if you do that, I can't be the best, and I want to be the best, and that's all I'm going to commit to. I can't commit to you and this, so you have to go." um, what were your thoughts on that, all the way to the point where you have Schaefer throwing Neiman out of the school, more or less?
Oof. You know what? I need a moment to think on this. So I'm turning the question back around on you. So it's not
Sure.
always me responding to your question. What are
Sure.
your thoughts on Neiman's doom spiral due to Fletcher's teaching methods?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting um situation, right? And it plays out more or less how you kind of expect it to, as like nerve-wracking as it is, where it gets worse and worse, and you see, as he trains, he gets the blood on his hands, and he's getting these calluses that aren't quite healing, and so it's just getting ickier and stickier, and he's pushing himself more and more to be better and better, and he's getting pushed by Fletcher as he has these other elements coming in, right? He brings in his friend from the other class that he used to be a part of and has him sub in for him during practices, and this gets Neiman all concerned that he's going to lose his position as the lead drummer on the team or whatever, right? And then all these
First
different
chair.
things, right? Yeah, first chair, sorry. Um, so there's all these things he does, and he turns out on the back end you find out that that was all things Fletcher was doing to try to push Neiman to be harder on himself and to do better. But there's a certain sense in which he starts to really lose his brain. And I think that it's a very,
So far, you've summarized a lot. I'm trying to
yeah.
get your
So,
opinions.
so my opinions of it, I think, were kind of summarized in the revelation they have in this movie. And the
The
revelation is
Sean
all
Casey one?
about, yeah, Sean Casey. And Sean Casey is this
No relation.
person that yeah, exactly. That Fletcher had taught in the past and that had then died. Turns out, revelation later, which I saw coming, was that Sean Casey had actually committed suicide, right? And that was due to the stress and the pressure of this environment that he had been taught, or at least supposedly due to this environment that he had been taught in by Fletcher. So those kind of generally summarize my thoughts. Is like when that happened, I was like, "Yep, 100%. That's where this is going." Because I think that while it's from a real world perspective, right? I think that you do want outside pressure to push yourself, but there does come, and sometimes you do need that extra of pressure to get you above something you're comfortable with, right? That being said, if you're going to the point where your hands are bleeding and you are losing your girlfriend, and you are literally like tackling the person who's teaching you on stage because you're upset with them, you have gone to a neurotic state beyond what is healthy, and you potentially are going to cause bigger problems beyond just um, being the greatest drummer in the world. You could actually cause harm to the people around you. So, um, those are my like general thoughts on the real world implications of what was happening, and I think those were demonstrated well in the film. But in regards to like them building it up from a storytelling perspective, I thought it was done very well. Like I was very intrigued. I was fully engaged, and I think that yeah, everything was well done.
Yeah, I think it really plays into communicating to the audience that the path that Neiman takes. Would you prefer that we use the characters' names or the actors' names, by the way? I guess I should have
I
asked at the
generally
beginning.
say the characters'
Oh,
names just because
okay,
if someone's not familiar with the actors, at the very least they should know the characters based off of the watching the film.
great. You're questioning throughout the movie whether what Neiman is doing is his fault or like he bears the brunt of the responsibility or
Mm,
whether it's Fletcher going way beyond was acceptable. And every time Neiman is willing to take a step that like supposedly will catapult him to greatness, like was the onus ever on Neiman to say no, or like what should like Fletcher have been held accountable for the steps? And like the movie kind of goes back and forth between some of these steps you could definitely pin on Neiman and say this is an example of how
right,
Neiman's like a flawed character, right?
right,
Breaking up with his girlfriend's a good one,
right.
where like he broke up with her, but he was a huge asshole about it.
Yeah, yeah,
um,
100%.
and then on the flip side, you have like the way Fletcher will just like hold hours long, like making them do repetitions of double time to try and like see if they can drum roll really fast.
Right,
And like that's probably a huge abuse of power because as his teacher, he can like hold things like grades overhead and say like you
right,
will be kicked out if you don't do this thing. So like
right.
I think is really complemented by switching between who may or may not bear responsibility for this teaching process, which
Hmm.
like helps to continue to cause the audience to question whether it's worth it. You could, as you talk about, say, well, there's real world implications that this could drive someone insane and start physically attacking people, or this could drive someone to kill themselves.
Hmm.
I think there's also like real world implications of like were they supposed to stop themselves before it got to this point
Oh
like
yeah,
it, yeah
for sure. No, keep going, keep going. I
or
didn't want to
like
stop you.
is the type of person who is going to respond to these like in the form of violence to themselves or others is this like intrinsically linked to good art or like
Right, sure.
having the mental drive to care so deeply about art that you like get violent over it, is it
Hmm.
also the same drive that makes you great at it to the point you've
Hmm.
mastered the skill? You
Right,
start to ask yourself these questions and it's like, well, if art is intrinsically linked to caring about it so much you get violent, is it worth it? Or should we like retroactively look at all this old art and ask ourselves, is it truly great based on what it cost?
right. Yeah, that's interesting. It goes back to when you said that, that immediately made me think of there's like a statistic that goes like if you're more or less if you're a poet, you're 9 times more likely to commit suicide, right? And it's like almost like a risk of the trade, if you will, that this idea that there's a huge risk alongside the idea that you go into something that you consider great art in that regard. So yeah, I don't think that that's an unfair point to make, that some things are inherently more risky to be involved with. Just we see that more clearly in things such as, say, sports, right? You might be really good at football, but you're going to be a vegetable in 30 years type thing, right? But we don't necessarily see that as well in the psychological viewpoint of something, say, uh, being a great drummer in the example of this. So, yeah, I think that that's an interesting aspect to take. Yeah, and you can also even go to the people that some people have a greater neurological tendency to go down certain avenues, and that's why they're great at something, right? Because they have the natural tendency of the mind to be a little off in this way, and that has problems, but it also has benefits. So, um, not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but when it comes to, and that goes back to what you were saying, right? How much of this is self-driven versus individually driven, or by teacher-driven, right? And
External, internal. Yeah, yeah.
right, um,
Should we move on to the next topic?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's kind of starting to go in circles, so that's fair.
I I I think that the way this topic just ended, where it's like, yeah, and we have a hard time coming to a definitive conclusion, is reflective of the way the movie ends. This movie asks you lots and lots of questions, but it doesn't really ever look you in the eye and go, "This is the right way, audience," and then move on.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing because it makes you think it does when he gets thrown out of the school and he goes, right, he literally gets out of a car that got hit by a semi and goes on to drum at the location where they were doing this performance, right? And he loses his uh, he proceeds to not be at that school anymore because of that experience, and he goes back home, and all he's got is gushers in his pantry, and his dad leaves, and he's got nothing, right? He's put it all on the line. He did his absolute best, and it's all gone. And it's almost like if you were to stop the movie there, the lesson would be no, it's not worth it. It's not how you teach. It's not what ambition leads to. All of those themes completely invalidated.
Which would be the cliche, by the way,
Right.
right? The cliche
Right.
would be to go, "This is a tale of tragedy, and these are the consequences of ambition." And then it keeps going.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. And then you take that, right? And then it goes into he sees. Well, first he files the suit against Fletcher, or I don't know if he did that before. Or no, he does that after. And then he sees Fletcher playing at the jazz club. They have their little discussion, and then Fletcher invites him to go and be part of this performance they're going to do. And he goes to the performance. Bam! Fletcher's pulled a fast one on him. They're playing music that Neiman doesn't know, and that's because he wants to embarrass and destroy Neiman's entire musical career because he knows that Neiman ruined his career. So, tit for tat, screw you, you're done. And that's where you have the climactic scene where he does the solo with the drums on the next musical piece that they play. And in that moment, Fletcher comes together and works with him to encourage him to play even better in that solo. Boom. End of movie. What were your thoughts, Sean, on that ending?
If this movie did not end the way it did, I would have hated the movie, or at least just thought it was a lot more cliche. Like if this final section was not constructed the way it was, this would be like 2 points lower.
Right.
Because the fact that it causes you to question rather than like have a definitive answer, I think is really important. Where
Right.
it's like, oh, all along, I guess Fletcher maybe did have something going on because he does like shoot for greatness, but
Right.
it's still like his dad is watching off stage in like a horrified faction that like
Right.
this all-consuming drive to be a great drummer has consumed his son to the point where his abusive teacher is egging him on in like a music battle in front of like hundreds of people. I
Yes.
appreciate that
Yes.
this I appreciate this conflict because it's a music movie, is like shown through music rather than say, for example, like they get into a fist fight or like they
Right.
argue in words
Hmm.
or like the administration comes in and goes, "Fletcher, you've done something wrong." The fact that
Right.
like the way the conflict is driven is purely communicated through almost entirely music with like a little bit of dialogue is great.
Hmm.
And on
Yeah.
top of that, you as the audience understand the progression of like how this music battle works, even if you're not a musician. Like
Hmm.
you like get very clear indications that like there's one drummer and there's the entire band. And the
Hmm.
drummer serves as like this key focal point for keeping time and like understanding their music signals. And when that fails, it causes the whole band to fall apart. Like
Right.
even an untrained ear can tell there's discordance that happens when he fails.
Right.
But as soon as he starts to take control as the drummer, like everything starts to fall together, and then eventually the rest of the band just stops playing because he's on his solo and everything is focused on him. You
Right.
can hear and see the skills that he's accomplished because you've seen all the suffering happening prior to the movie. So
Right.
like there's a lot that goes on here in terms of the presentation of information and the way it like coincides with its themes that I think like make the movie great.
Yeah.
Absent that, this would be a pretty mediocre by the numbers movie.
Yeah. And it's important to note that this is important, especially for the sake of show don't tell, because they lean very much into showing. how things should be played out. And because it's music and it's all played out through the music, that is how the tension is drawn and added, and the climax is really built up. There's like nothing said during the climax. There's like maybe 2 sentences or something like that, 3 sentences, but as a whole, all of it is played through the drums, through the what do you call what Fletcher's role is, the conductor, right?
Conductor,
Like
yeah.
like all of these, their actions as part of the music is what builds it up, and you could see it all play out. It's just, yes, it's a
I
masterpiece.
do have a question for you.
Sure.
So, as someone who's trying to explore the best story construction possible,
Mm-hmm.
how do you feel that this movie essentially ends at the climax without any cool down period or seeing the results of the movie? Like, how do you think this plays into your larger understanding of what makes a good story? Because this movie essentially
Yeah.
it ends at the highest point possible and it's
Mm-hmm.
done.
You know, it's true, and it's actually something I've been thinking about a lot recently in regards to a different story. But for I think part of it is the intent, right? Like, what is the intent of the person telling the story, and is there enough components there? Well, okay, so first the question is one, is the story complete, right? If the story is complete, then uh, you don't necessarily need a denouement where everything cools down and you have the further explanation of what all plays out after that, right? The question of this movie, more or less, is ambition and the teaching role and the pushing of yourself in a music setting, like, are all of those able to be fulfilled by going to this extreme? And there's a certain sense in which it's like, yes, maybe, but also this environment they did it in was a little unorthodox, so not exactly, but they also achieved their goal. I mean, supposedly this was a based off of what you saw, it looks like Fletcher gives the approval that this is an incredible solo, which means you're an incredible artist or a credible musician, which means hopefully you would go down as in with accolades as one of the greatest drummers of all time, right? But we don't see that play out. Do we know that will play out? We don't know. But what we do know is that he's gotten Fletcher's approval, which means what? We know that if he's gotten Fletcher's approval and Fletcher has one of the highest standards out there, that this person has achieved a greatness in Fletcher's eyes that is worthy of someone who's a world-renowned musician. If we know that, then that means the other three, the themes we have discussed, are probably fulfilled. We can reasonably infer that. So, if you look at the questions of the film and see can those be answered by the climax and by how this movie ended, then I'd say that that's enough. Does that mean that you know for sure that he becomes a world-renowned musician? No, you don't. And that's okay. And generally, in my opinion, it's better to leave the audience wanting a little bit more and not having every question answered than having everything over explained, over answered, and wasting people's time with things that weren't necessary in the story. So that's where I kind of defer. There are even certain storylines where I think you can have some questions not even answered
Okay.
that maybe are important. But that's a whole
So,
another point.
well,
So go ahead.
I do want to ask, just to give
Sure.
your audience a taste,
Sure.
if you're referencing a future or past review, because you have said another story. You're clearly thinking of some other story where this conversation is also relevant about like
Sure.
ending at a climax or a
Sure.
cooldown. Would you mind explaining to us what that one you're skirting around is?
So, the one of the stories I'm thinking of specifically is, and this is a discussion we had around The Dark Knight, is The Dark Knight has some themes about this idea of anarchy, and those do get answered in the third film, but there's a sense in which in the second film they really don't get answered. And so there is some discussion. The movie does get completed, but the idea of like the Joker's anarchy that he's trying to embody and fulfill isn't necessarily fully answered in that film itself. So If you want to see the full discussion on that, look to that review because that was a little bit of a botched explanation of that. But yeah, that's a pretty short explanation. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
Excellent.
So yeah,
Nope, no, definitely.
I know that was a little teasing of a way to put it. So yeah. Anyways, where were we? So that is the climax. I also appreciate the climax just because it takes. This was one of the few times where you have the antagonist of the film and the protagonist of the film come together and work together to achieve the ends of the film. And it worked. It actually worked so well. It worked beautifully. And a lot of times when they try to do that, I start to scratch my head and go, I don't know about this. I don't know if this works. But in this case, because of how they set it up, right, he's also the teacher and all these other things, it actually worked really well. But what were your
I
thoughts,
have a
Sean?
question. Would you consider Fletcher the antagonist in this
Yeah.
story?
Yeah,
Okay,
100%.
gotcha.
But I think it's an interesting role for him because, and this goes back to the themes. Normally, when you have like a character and they embody a theme that you're trying to encompass, you have the antagonist either oppose that theme or they represent a completely different theme, and the themes come into conflict with each other. In this case, there's a sense in which both Neiman and Fletcher represent the same things, just from different roles. And so
Okay, gotcha. Yeah,
I
yeah,
thought that it was an interesting dynamic from this film's perspective in how they were in some ways opposing because Neiman and Fletcher did not. Well, Fletcher might have liked Neiman. We don't really know because he was kind of a jerk about everything. But you know that Neiman doesn't really like Fletcher, and they're not really friends.
true.
But they are trying to push toward the same. They have the same ideals, and because of that, you see them coming at each other with the idea that both the rising tide will lift all boats, and it will lift them up to greatness. So, um, yeah, it was a masterful piece on how they built all of that. That's what I'll say.
Great.
Um, when you look at this film, what are your thoughts on? I mean, is there any other characters that we need to mention before we leave off? I mean, maybe the father's worthy of some discussion. Maybe the original drummer. I don't know, but anything you want to say on those characters? The girlfriend,
I
even.
mean, I think the most important thing about these characters is just, it's kind of the opposite of fridging, or not fridging. What do you call it? The Bechdel test. You know what the Bechdel test is?
Isn't that the one they
Okay,
do in
so
Interstellar?
no. The Bechdel
Okay.
test is a idea about art, which says that can two women have a conversation without it being in reference to a man? And it's the idea that like are the character like it's specifically like a pretty gendered critique where it says like female characters are only written with respect to men, but men like talk about things other than women. But like I think that idea like in a way, I'll get there, extends to a lot of the side characters in this movie, which is that
Okay.
all of the side characters in the movie, like, yes, are their own people, but like
Hmm.
they only are always ever in conversation with one of the two. It's either Neiman
Right.
is in the scene or Fletcher's in the scene. There's never really ever a scene where like neither of them are present and two side characters are having a conversation.
Right.
The movie
Right.
starts with them together, the movie ends with them together. It's a
Right.
movie about a jazz band, but the only thing that matters on the entire band is just Andrew Neiman, who's one
Right.
person amongst them.
Right.
So it's like what more can we say about many of the side characters without them just being in relation to what we've already said about the main characters?
Right.
Like,
Right.
we could talk about the father slightly. I think the father's just the consciousness of the audience made manifest. He's like the gut reaction the audience has to everything that happens in the film. This is
Right.
obviously bad for you. Why do you keep doing it? Or
Right.
like or it's just saying, I don't think dying at 30 on the street is good for you, of like ODing and heroin. Like
Right.
he's just a consciousness like Jiminy Cricket. And like his most powerful role to me isn't even when he speaks. His most powerful role to me is at the end when he's watching his son on the side, and like you as the audience are gonna go, "Yeah, Neiman's doing it," and you see his dad's face, you're like, "Is this even a good thing that Neiman's doing it?"
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an interesting, I guess it's a fair point. That's probably more of what he is. I definitely was thinking more along the lines of him being the almost like the opposite of Fletcher, where Fletcher is this hard pushing, individual who's like, you gotta to achieve greatness, you have to be the absolute best. And the father more representing this idea of like, oh, maybe mediocrity is okay, or maybe this idea that if you're loving and caring of people, that will help them to achieve the greatness that they want in life because they'll find the freedom to express themselves or whatever mindset have you in that universe. But yeah, I think that both of those are either way you take that for him. He's definitely the more quote unquote conservative, safe route for someone who wants to achieve greatness. And regardless of however those other themes are developed, it's pretty safe to assume that that answer was not validated in this film. So, as much as it's good to have supporting and loving people in your life, I want to say that.
It is good. It is good. He is a father, and Fletcher is a mentor, and this movie makes it pretty clear the difference between the two of them.
Yeah, absolutely. What are your thoughts on this film, though? I mean, the Annals of Time. How would they look at this?
Um, I think this is a movie that will continue to be looked upon really favorably. I think like all the things that aren't in the plot really quickly. Camera work, really great camera work. Okay, there's some really cool and creative shots here. In the way that like it tries to get you into the mood and mindset. The music, it's a jazz drumming like movie, and there's like a music bell at the end. Obviously, some of the music is going to be amazing. Dialogue,
Absolutely.
really tight, really smart. Like the acting, excellent. I think that there's a lot of things about this movie that'll stand the test of time. There's one thing that I think would make this movie undermined is that the style of teaching Fletcher does is one that is going extinct. And many people would say that's a really good thing. What Fletcher represents is a very harsh and cruel style of teaching that, at least in
Hmm.
formalized education systems, is trying to be eliminated. Like, if you want to like tell a very teleological narrative, which is just to say that history is progressive, like the 50s or like earlier, you have teachers that can literally beat their students with wooden sticks, and
Right.
that
Right.
like abuse and punishment are meant to be primary motivators to teach someone. And
Hmm.
then like as like we realize, oh, psychology is like an actual field of study we could do, or and therapy is real, and we start to value more as a society things like mental health. Like a lot of the way teachers and professors are taught to teach is to not use like punishment as a motivator, but to use reward as a motivator, or to
Hmm.
encourage internal motivation, which
Hmm.
means that like Fletcher represents an old guard like style of teaching that like is trying to be eliminated. And this
Hmm.
movie is based on horror stories told by music students at certain music schools, and
Right.
on like some of the personal life experience of the director, which is like early 2000s/90s. So like
Hmm.
we may like grow up in a world where people look at this and they go, this is compelling, but at the same time, it doesn't really happen anymore. This is describing a
Right.
problem or a conflict about teaching that isn't relevant. At least
Right.
in my opinion, I think that's why it won't stand for that reason.
Yeah. No, I remember reflecting on that even as I was watching it was, you don't really see that same degree of pressure placed on students anymore. And there's a lot of sense in which you could get in big trouble if you are teaching students to that same degree nowadays. So yeah,
I will say I have had. I'm an academic. Okay,
mhm,
I've gone. Currently in an institution for higher learning, and I graduated from one. And I will say that I have run into a few professors that remind me of Fletcher. They
sure.
still
Yeah.
exist.
Yeah.
They're not gone, but
Right.
they're under the current. Okay.
Sure. Yeah. And they probably take pride in being that the Fletcher type. So there's definitely the I think, I mean, I go back to even the classes that I took myself and thinking about some of the ones that I drew the most out of were definitely harder teachers, right? People that pushed you to learn more, but they weren't necessarily at the same time to the degree that Fletcher was. And should they have been? Should they not have been? And if all of the teachers had been, what would that say about my mental health? I don't know. But yeah, I don't know that that's fully answered. But I think that at the very least, there's something to be said about the pushing toward greatness. And I hope it stands for decades to come because it's definitely worth a watch. It's definitely a consideration. And even having watched it, not liking the protagonist that much, not knowing anything about music, I'd still watch it again. I encourage people to watch it. I think it's great. It's an excellent film. It's thought provoking, and it definitely deserves being known as an incredible film.
Give it a watch, guys. This is gonna be one of the best movies you've seen of all time, even if you don't like it as much as I do.
There we go. And yeah, I think that's about it. So that's the pod. We hope you all enjoyed. We will be back as we always are next week. We'll see you all then.